The Nintendo 64 holds a special place in many gamers' hearts, not to mention my own. Long before its release, I was a Nintendo fanboy, but nothing would compare to the utter joy I got from my 64. I was obsessed, hooked. I spent every waking minute trying to play it. In fact, my mum had to hide the controllers just to get me out of the house. Well, this year marks the 15th birthday of the Nintendo 64, so we thought we'd take a look back at the legacy of this 64-bit legend. The story of the console's development is full of controversy and intrigue, but it was the games that we had the deepest connection with, so let's start with those. Super Mario 64 was all you could have asked for in a launch title. It took the much-loved 2D star Mario and gave him a spectacular 3D reimagining. The game not only showed off the new power of the Nintendo 64, but it created the building blocks for many of today's games, inspiring the industry's development profoundly. Few video games could match the sheer giddy delight we got from Mario 64 back in 1997. Things like realising that mountain off in the distance was able to be climbed, that was something else. It scattered clever objectives around its levels and gave you the freedom to explore and tackle them at your own pace. There aren't many games out there that deserve to be described as magical, but this is one of them. Just like Mario reshaped the platforming genre, the James Bond game GoldenEye set the standards for console first-person shooters for the years to come. GoldenEye introduced more features that we take for granted today than I could possibly list. Okay, what the hell, I'll give it a go. Stealth gameplay, zoomable sniper rifles, mission objectives like hacking computers, bullet holes in scenery, enemies that reacted to where you shot them, remote mines, NPCs you could complete objectives with, security cameras, blocks you could shoot off, throwing knives, vehicles you could drive, and the biggest of all, split-screen multiplayer. This game was amazing. GoldenEye gave us a gaming experience that was literally years ahead of its time. The next title in the Triforce of unforgettable N64 games was, of course, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Where Mario 64 and GoldenEye's gameplay was confined to disconnected locations, Zelda delivered a fully fleshed out world we could explore, packed with tasks to complete and its own day and night cycles. Zelda also gave us a ton of new gameplay innovations. Previously, fighting enemies in 3D games was a clumsy mess as you struggled to keep both your attacks and view focused on an enemy. Zelda solved this with its Z targeting, which locked your attacks and the camera onto a specific enemy. Context-sensitive actions and auto-jumping were another two innovations Zelda created to allow you to navigate its sprawling world without the need to memorise 50 button combinations. With Ocarina of Time, Nintendo's gaming guru, Shigeru Miyamoto, had created what many considered to be his opus, and 14 years after its release, it still stands as the most critically acclaimed game of all time. While we were busy having fun collecting stars in Mario or playing ocarinas in Zelda, there were some fascinating power struggles going on behind the scenes. Not unlike Apple of recent times, Nintendo was intensely protective, wanting to control every aspect of their gaming technology. Sony's PlayStation was almost a CD add-on for Nintendo. Both companies were in discussions to partner on a console in the early 90s, but Nintendo snubbed Sony and cancelled discussions, creating its biggest rival in the process. Fueled by a desire to exact vengeance on Nintendo, Sony released the PlayStation, and we all know how that turned out. Now that Nintendo was in direct competition with Sony, they needed to pull something special out of the bag, so they created the Nintendo 64. The 64 referred to it having a 64-bit CPU. While its competitors Sony and Sega had 32-bit consoles, the Nintendo 64's processor and graphics chip allowed it to do more advanced effects like Liquid Metal Mario, but its limited memory meant it didn't have much 3D grunt as the other consoles. This led to the infamous N64 fog. A thick pea soup fog was used in many games to limit your vision and hide the fact that the N64 could only generate the 3D background a few meters in front of you. When the 64 launched back in '97, CDs were the dominant form of storage technology. Nintendo stubbornly chose to use cartridges. It was this decision more than any other that was responsible for PlayStation outselling the N64.
This is the end of the road.
Cartridges did have some advantages over CDs, namely they had faster loading times and were more child-friendly as they were practically unbreakable. There were some serious downsides, however. They were far more costly to produce, they could only store 5% of a CD's capacity, plus you had to do this a lot. Many high-profile publishers simply refused to work with Nintendo and be restricted by their cartridges, most famously Squaresoft, whose Final Fantasy series had previously been exclusive to Nintendo. Instead, they chose to jump ship and create the hugely successful Final Fantasy VII exclusively for PlayStation. The list of previously loyal publishers who turned their back on Nintendo reads like a who's who of today's franchises. But quality over quantity would become the defining theme for the Nintendo 64. Without the support of many big game publishers, the responsibility of creating blockbuster hits would rest solely on Nintendo's shoulders. Other classics to come from the Nintendo stable included Mario Kart 64, which expanded on the original game by adding a brilliant 4-player split-screen mode. Wave Race 64 had amazing water physics and sublime handling. Star Fox had epic 3D space combat, and Pilot Wings gave us the feeling of immense freedom and exploration. Then there was the surprisingly mature Zelda sequel Majora's Mask, a game that built on the successes from Ocarina and is in fact my favourite game of all time. Rare, the studio behind GoldenEye, was second only to Nintendo in its ability to create amazing N64 games. Perfect Dark, Banjo-Kazooie, and Diddy Kong Racing were all huge successes, but arguably the biggest compliment Rare received was the trust Nintendo placed in it to make important games like Donkey Kong 64, using key Nintendo characters.
Well done!
And who could forget the N64's iconic controller?
Complete 3D movement.
Its analog stick and rumble pack were hugely popular.
Unique rumble pack.
You can find elements of both of these in all of today's controllers. It's hard to not look back on my time with the N64 without getting a warm and fuzzy feeling. It was responsible for so many of my greatest gaming moments, and I'm sure many of you feel the same. So happy 15th birthday, Nintendo 64. Now, if you don't mind, I've got a date with nostalgia.